I'm Joshua Lax, fountain pen user, collector,
A bit like all of Andrew's, right?
and all-around fanatic. In fact, I'm so obsessed, I started a business where I get to work with other people's pens. But now I want to show you everything I love about the world of fountain pens. From the new pens, to the old pens, the nibs, the ink, the paper, and especially the people. This is Uncapped. So my last episode was made in response to some really great questions from a viewer's comments a few weeks ago. And in my last video, I focused on all sorts of aspects of nib units from Schmidt, Bock, and JOWO, which are probably the three largest makers of standardized nib units in the West. They are all supposed to be based in Germany. You can read online whether that is completely true or partially true. It's not for me to comment, but they're all considered German nib companies. And they all have a place in both pen history and in the kind of world of modern pens. But as many of you know, in the last few years, the pens coming from China have become much more prevalent, as has pens from India. And in both of those countries, they are making nib units, and no doubt many of you are familiar with, and I've talked about on the channel before, Magna Carta, which makes some of their own nib units. But there's other companies in India, and there's a lot of, obviously, companies in China, or it looks like there's more than one company in China, that make a lot of nibs. And so I wanted to devote a second video to a discussion of those. One, to keep the prior episode somewhat shorter, but also because there's more to say about the nib units from China and India that you don't necessarily have when you talk about brands like Bock or JOWO and the brands that in turn use them. So with that being said, I'd like to now turn to the nibs that come out of those countries. And we're going to start with India, and then we'll turn to China. So let's have a look. The first thing to say about pens from India and nib units is that, unlike a lot of companies, it is still possible to actually buy pens from India that don't accept standard nib units and are in fact made like fountain pens were made, 100 years ago, 125 years ago. What do I mean by that? Well, in India, they still sell what they're called eyedropper fillers, meaning there is no nib unit that takes a cartridge or a converter. You literally fill the barrel with ink up into the threads here, and then, you have a section that is bored out, but it is not threaded, and you can slide a feed and nib into it. Now, why am I highlighting this? Well, one of the questions the viewer asked, it was, I think, at David Alexander-Watts 6630, was, about nib interchangeability and swapping nibs. If you are someone that really enjoys swapping nibs, taking a nib from one pen, putting it with another, this actually is a really interesting way to go, because you can really customize a pen and then put a world of nibs into it, depending on what it is you have in mind. So what I'm holding here, these are two Ranga eyedroppers. So this is clear acrylic that has like a matte finish. This is just a standard black ebonite. And what I wanted to highlight for you is that you can actually get feeds. So when you get a pen like this, it comes with an ebonite feed. The problem with the ebonite feeds in an eyedropper is they lack sufficient surface area compared to modern feeds, right? So a modern feed, if you think about it, has all these little fins, it has all this space. That is helpful in holding the ink supply back. When you have a plain ebonite feed, it's just basically a smooth ebonite finish all the way around with a channel for it. And what happens in those circumstances is that because it lacks that complexity, it doesn't have enough surface area to hold back the ink from inside the pen at a certain point, and it will leak. So I highlight that as, you know, a reason to do what I'm suggesting if you have an eyedropper pen. So what I do is I harvest the feeds from Schaefer no nonsense nib units, and you can look up the pens online. The nib units, often I get the calligraphy pack and then I take apart the nib units just to get the feeds, right? Because if you look at this, this is a very complicated feed, and it usually fits the nib, the section that you're going to be inserting it into pretty well with a nib. So let me just show you as an example of what I'm talking about here, right? So I just have a fully wen, which we'll talk about later, and I'm going to put it onto my nib, and then I'm going to insert the whole thing into the pen. And it's not a perfect fit, but you get the idea, right? And so basically what you're doing is you're putting in a new feed that is going to hold back the in supply, and you're putting in a nib. You can use the original nib. Usually they were too fine for my taste. And this nib actually is a little bit thin for this purpose, but you can experiment with other ones, and it does take some experimentation. There is no standardized way to do this. But you can see you have basically a pen that's going to write, and it works pretty well when you get it right. Okay, let me take that out. Now, I have also used vintage Schaefer school pens, because vintage Schaefer school pens on their own had far more complex feeds, but they were made out of ebonite, which is kind of nice when you think about it. And this one here actually has a vintage pen. It is from the Moore Pen Company. It is a Manaflex, it says Manaflex. So I guess it's a manifold nib that is also flexy. And I'm just getting a piece of paper. This pen has had ink in it for years, and it still writes. Like, this is pre-COVID, the same ink sitting in the barrel, and that feed is still holding the ink, and it seals that well that I can basically use this nib. Well, I could use this pen, not just the nib, but I can use this pen now, like 7 years on since I filled it. So kind of an incredible thing, just something I'm highlighting about the possibility with feeds, nibs, and things from India. But this type of pen kind of went out of fashion at some point in the 2010s. It used to be you would get Indian pens that were all eyedroppers, but at some point they actually started using the standardized nib units, and as we're about to discuss, India now has its own nib unit makers. So you don't necessarily, if you're uncomfortable with this format, you can forego it, right? And so to give you an example, this is a Ranga, and it's actually, it can be used as an eyedropper or a cartridge converter. I think I used it as an eyedropper. That's why it's a little dirty around where the section meets the barrel. But, you know, again, in terms of interchangeability, what would typically happen with a company like Ranga is you would order the pen and you would tell them what nib unit you want to be able to fit into the pen. So, for example, I guess Ranga has these group buys that they do. So they have special pricing for a certain set of models at a particular time. And so you get them by email, you see them on Instagram, and then you can basically pick out from the materials that they have on hand and the design that they're offering a pen, and then you can tell them what type of nib unit you want in there. So you're able to do Schmidt. I'm pretty sure you're able to do Bock. You can definitely do JOWO, and we'll talk about the Indian nibs in a second. So that is, you know, another aspect of interchangeability. The thing that you need to know with Ranga, and really any custom pen that you have made, it's really one type of nib per section, meaning it's either Schmidt compatible, Bock compatible, or JOWO compatible per section. It is possible, I believe, that they will make you multiple sections. So if you wanted to have a section for a pen like this with a Schmidt nib, they'll do it. If you want one for Bock, they'll do it. and if you want one for JOWO, they'll do it. And you can basically mix and match, and that's like yet another kind of pleasant aspect of ordering Indian pens, is like you can get a lot of variety. If you want, they can customize things, they can change the length of the model. Ranga in particular is very versatile with that, because I think some of their pens or all their pens are still handmade. So definitely something worth checking out if you are someone who enjoys, and I fall into this category, swapping nibs around, kind of custom building things up. This is a good option and a way to go. The other thing I'll say is that they do now take number 8 nibs. So this is a Magna Carta nib unit that is in yet another, a little dirty from ink there. This is another Ranga model in premium ebonite, and then we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but this is also a Ranga, same model I just showed you, different ebonite, different nib setup. We'll talk about that in a second. All right. Before I get too far afield from my point here, let me move these out of the way, and let's talk about what are the Indian nib units. So there's several companies in India that make nibs. There's one called Ambitious. There is another one called Kanwrite. Many of you are no doubt familiar with Magna Carta. But the one that seems to be making a lot of nibs for a lot of different people is in fact Kanwrite. So I have, as just an example here, so Kanwrite makes nibs, Kanwrite makes pens. So I have 2 Kanwrite pens here, and they're branded Kanwrite, so I know that's what they are. That issue will be discussed a little more in depth in a second. But I believe this is the Desiree model, and as you can see, it has a Kanwrite nib. Now, why am I focusing on Kanwrite? It would appear to me that Kanwrite is the nib maker in India, aside obviously from all the pens that Magna Carta does, but Kanwrite is the one whose nibs seem to be most in use with other brands, meaning other brands will either buy Kanwrite nibs and brand them as their own, or they'll buy the Kanwrite nibs and the pens and brand them as their own. I'll show you examples of that in a second, right? And this particular one has the ebonite feed. Now, where might you have seen this type of feed before? For those of you that have Nahvalur's pens, I believe Kanwrite was the maker. Some of those nibs they sold, well, some of the Nahvalur's nibs, they were sold a version of their own. The thing I don't think that they were ever able to sell was the triple tail or the music nib that had the 3 tie-in pen. Anyway, so they do these ebonite feeds in this pen, and I believe this one, this is the Mammoth. I mentioned the Mammoth X, or showed you the Mammoth X in the Big Nib episode, the Age of Giants. Here is the Mammoth X, or sorry, the Mammoth with their number 9 nib. Also has that ebonite feed, right? So these are their pens. It's an ebonite pen. This is like a resin that smells terrible, much like some of the Nahvalur's pens. So those are the Kanwrite pens. But as I said, one can buy pens from another brand with Kanwrite nibs, and one can buy Kanwrite pens with Kanwrite nibs branded as someone else, right? So this right here is actually also a Ranga pen. It came from Fountain Pen Revolution. You can see there's a Fountain Pen Revolution nib on it. Right there, it says FBR. But this is a Kanwrite nib in a Ranga pen, branded for Fountain Pen Revolution, right? And it's a model I think Ranga makes specifically for Fountain Pen Revolution, and I'll just comment that I kind of love this model. And then we have here a FPR branded nib in a pen that I believe was made for FPR by Kanwrite. I can't be sure. One way to tell is to look at the, well, I don't really get much of an indication from the converter. It may not be, honestly, but my feeling is it more than likely is based on some of the hardware, but it might not be. In any event, why am I highlighting this? So these are just examples of nib units from Kanwrite being used. Now I'm going to show you actually, these are Kanwrite nib units right here. And I have from years ago a actually 14 karat gold nib unit right here that I believe is also made by Kanwrite. So these two are steel Ranga nibs that I believe were made by Kanwrite, and this is the housing and feed made by Kanwrite. And so if you take these apart, you'll see that as with many makers that make standardized nib units, they follow the same model that I was talking about in the prior episode. There is a nib, there is a feed, and there is a housing. Now, what happens though is unlike the companies Bock, JOWO, and Schmidt that make their own format, my understanding is that Kanwrite does their housings either to spec to match a JOWO housing or to match a Bock housing. So right here we have I took out of my Esterbrook, my JOWO Esterbrook nib, and I should be able to screw in a Ranga Kanwrite nib, right? So I now have a Indian nib in my Esterbrook, right? And the reason it can be done that way is because these housings are near identical when you look at them in terms of the shape. What is not identical is the material that they're made out of, and I'm going to talk about some of the problems I've had with these types of nibs in the future, or in the past. This is a different shape, obviously, than, this is a different shape than you see with the JOWO or the JOWO style housings. And I'm actually going to pull out a Bock housing, a Bock nib. So here's a Levenger Bock nib, and to compare them, because I think that this is actually the Bock style housing. So if you have one of these nibs from Kanwrite, you would be able to insert them into a Bock pen. Now, Bock nibs are not used all that much anymore. However, I do have a Ranga that has a Bock nib in it. So when I bought this, I told them, make it a Bock. And we will test it out in there to see if my supposition is correct, right? This is just a nib I ground. I use this myself. Okay. So here is the actual Bock nib. As you can see, it screws in. So it's a Bock, Levenger Bock nib, I should put it this way. But let's test this 14 karat gold nib. I don't think this is the flexible one, but I may be incorrect. It's a little tight, which may just be a matter of tolerances, but it is in fact screwing in, right? One thing to know with these Ranga pens is that because they're done by hand, the tolerances are not always perfect. And it's not really to blame anyone for that, but it's just a reality when you get the custom-made pens, and I find it particularly with the ebonite. This pen here that they made for Fountain Pen Revolution, either because they made a number of them or something else, I found that were a little bit more reliable than when you dealt with the kind of custom stuff that you order. But the Bock nibs screwed into it perfectly fine. It also may be a problem with this housing, and we'll talk about these housings again in a moment. So that is, one level of the interchangeability, and why I'm covering this as a separate episode is that these are not necessarily nibs that are a thing unto themselves, and you need to only have a Kanwrite pen to accommodate them. These actually will interchange with whatever they're telling you, and you can see it right with the naked eye that there is a difference. I actually have, pardon me, that was the bag for that. I have in this pen, and maybe we'll write with it shortly, another 14 karat nib. One of those I thought were flexible, but I guess not. Maybe in a different pen. But in any event, I put it into this pen that takes Bock nibs. I think I bought these at the same time. So it's pretty much the same as this. All right, now I've referenced a couple times some issues with these particular nib housings. And what is that? If you look at the JOWO, if you look at the Bock we just had over here in a second, you will see that they are really good injection molded plastic. There's been talk in the past about cracking in these housings. I think I've seen it like twice out of thousands of JOWOs I've dealt with. So I would not get too caught up, and it's an easy thing to change out if you should encounter that. And I can go back into my SD. All right. So what's been my one issue with the quality here is the issue. So the plastic that they use on these nib units is not great. It just isn't. I mean, there's no way to say it any differently. The nibs have these little spots on the bottom. So you see it right there, and then you see it right here. Right? You see those little circular indentations. Now, what I've found, you can see them right here. Right? I believe that those marks or fissures in the housings are from where they injection mold the plastic into it. And actually you can see through it pretty well. I mean, it's just not great plastic. And because they are like using whatever to do the mold connects here, when they snap it off or whatever they're doing, they're not cutting it properly. And I find that sometimes that this compromises the plastic, and then ink actually will leak out the back of these housings into your pen. So what do I do? What I do in these circumstances is I just put everything into a JOWO housing. I have JOWO housings from various projects I've done, various sources, and as a consequence, what I find is it's just easier to either put these nibs on the feed into the JOWO housing. So you can either use their feed, their original feed, which they're usually fine. That's not the problem. And then, or use the JOWO feed with these nibs. And let's see if we can just real quick demonstrate that without, well, that just snapped in pieces with me pulling the nib out, which is one, commends one to using, doing this methodology inside a pen, but two is just shows you kind of how easily that shatters, right? So as you can see, the nib fits almost perfectly in there, and you'd be good to go. Conversely, if you have the feed, you can put it on the feed, and that will fit right in there. And the one thing I don't know is if this feed will actually work with a Bock nib. Actually, let's just check that out, because that's why we're here, right? So that is so that is the JOWO housing. And I like these nibs. I like that they come in different nib widths. You can get double broad. They're now making obliques. They're making triple broads. I haven't tried any of those yet, but they're really cool. So I like the nibs, and I don't want to knock the nibs. It's just I know the housings leave something to be desired. So here is a Bock nib and feed. We are going to take the Bock feed. As you can see, it looks pretty good on there. And we are going to put that in there. And looks pretty good, right? So again, you can upgrade these components using the various analogs, or not really analogs. Let's just check out the feed. The feed here. You can you can swap these things around if you find that the parts are better quality, as I do. So the one thing is that this feed from their Bock housing or their Bock specs doesn't go into the actual Bock housing. So if you're going to swap a Kanwrite that's made for Bock into a Bock housing, you got to use the Bock feed. But again, some of these things can be found and gotten if you need them. Anyway, so that's the Kanwrite nib units. And they're, again, the nibs are good, but the housings give us a little bit of trouble. And so there is a solution for that, inevitably. All right, let's put this back together. Now, the other thing I just want to show you all, this is cracked too. So everything cracked today. We took it out for the video and they cooperated in a way that no one could have foreseen. All right. So that's Kanwrite. Again, I'm not trying to caution anyone. I'm just saying that this is just a reality of how they manufacture things. So those are the nib units from India. They can be interchanged. You can get lots of different pens from India. And again, one of the great things about Indian pens is just the degree to which you can get customized everything from various companies. There are, Kanwrite is not making custom pens for you, but there's still a number of makers over there that are fairly affordable that will custom make things in ebonite, and their ebonite is less expensive than Western ebonite, so there's a value to that. One other thing I want to show you about Kanwrite nibs. Now, some of you will have no doubt ordered a good blue pen, as I have. Fine pens. But one thing just to know is that these actually, I believe, are Kanwrite nib units that go into these. There's nothing wrong with that, but I just highlight that as something that people I don't think realize is that you are buying Kanwrite nibs from other places. This actually, as I'm looking at this, I may have swapped in a JOWO nib housing to replace this because I knew that these are very unreliable. The other big user of Kanwrite nibs that I know of is actually Tom Studio. And I know Tom Studio says a lot of different things about their products, but having worked with some of their pens, I can tell you that it is in fact a Kanwrite nib that is sitting in those pens. In fact, I think if you look at a Kanwrite Architect, which is potentially in here, and you look at a Tom Studio, so this is a Kanwrite Architect here. If you look at the Kanwrite Architect and you look at the Tom Studio Architect, they are virtually identical, even though they have different branding. So yet another way in which the Kanwrite nibs are used beyond what even I think a lot of people would have expected. We now turn to what we'll call standardized nib units from China. And let's start with number 6 size nibs. So I have here a Jinhao 100 or Jinhao Century. This is from the period after they replaced the arrow clip. And I have a Wingsung 699. A lot of the Wingsungs, I'll say, to me, have like a more proprietary design. Like I know the I forget if it's the 601, the smaller size. It's like almost like a Mont Blanc 144 or a Sailor Realo, that size. I think it's all friction fit. I don't even know if you can spin the nib out. And I actually don't know if this has a nib unit so much as it just fits in, because if you look at it, there's no real seam here. I'm not even sure you could see that. But you can pull the nib out and work with it. When it comes to Chinese pens, the first question I always ask is, can you upgrade the nib in some way? If you don't like they tend to be a lot of fine nibs, extra fine nibs. If you wanted something that was broad or you wanted something a little different, can you replace the nib with something else, right? So this is the 699 nib. As you can see, I'm going to attempt to insert a JOWO into it, and it doesn't really even want to go. So that's that. Sometimes the nib material itself is just too thick. The nib that you get, the 699, is thinner than a JOWO steel nib would be. So I tend to think of, with Wing Sung, the nib you get is the nib you get, unless it's something unusual. There is no real difference in what they have. They're good pens. I mean, there's a lot of them I find very enjoyable. But it's just, I tend to think of their nibs as being more proprietary rather than something that's interchangeable. Obviously, this feed is very different, and it's designed to be optimal with this imitation Pilot A23, known as the Wing Sun 699. Anyway, so that is that pen. Now, the Jinhaos are a little more interesting. So the Jinhao 100, or the Century, is based obviously on the Parker Duofold. And they actually do make now everything. I think everything comes in nib units, right? So you can get number 5, you can get number 6, and you can get number 8, which I have right here, which we can talk about in a second. This, the question I have is whether this will screw to anything else. Let's see if it's compatible with a JOWO nib unit. So let's just take this out. And I'm going to say that it's thicker, so that's not going to work. Nope. Question is, can it match a Bock? And the answer is maybe. The threads look like they're a different size. Let's see what we have here in the Bock department. Nope, that's not going to fit in there. Okay. So neither Bock nor JOWO are compatible with the Jinhao number 6. The other question is, well, let's put this back in. Now, usually you can work with Bock nibs. The question is, how do they play with other Western nib makers when you take them out of their housing? So that one's there. So you can see this comes in and out so much it makes no difference. All right. So this is the JOWO going into the a Jinhao going into a JOWO housing with a JOWO feed, and it looks pretty good. I mean, I haven't tried writing with this, but everything looks like it's seated real well, and there's no space in that area, which is usually my concern. So that's an interesting attribute. You, by the way, can buy loose Jinhao nibs, like in packs of 5 and 10 and etc. as you need them. All right, so here is the Bock nib we were playing with before. I put that on there. And this goes in pretty nice too. And as we can see, it fits a little bit better than, say, a JOWO would on it, but I can still see that space. So my feeling is that it might work because there is, but I can still see that little breather hole through the side there. The fact that I can't get it to show on camera might be a good sign as far as that's concerned, but nonetheless, I don't know if the Jinhao is really truly interchangeable with the Bock nib. It more or less fits. You might be able to heat set it and be good to go at that point, but looks like the JOWO is your best bet. Okay, so that is the Jinhao number 6 nib. In terms of other number 6 nibs, let's talk about Penbbs. Now, Penbbs is like an entity unto its own. If you're not familiar with, you should go online. They have a store on Etsy. They have social media presence. There's a lot of interesting pens. They do a whole bunch of what they call calligraphy nibs. It's basically various, I would say, grinds favorable to Asian characters that are different Asian writing styles, kanji, etc. But they're still fun to use even if you write in a Western language. This is an older model. It is the 480. I always love the 480 because it looks like a Schaefer balance. and I have a couple different ones. Now, what I did here was I swapped in a JOWO nib. So the reason I'm highlighting this is, and you got to be careful because like a Mont Blanc feed, the fins on these are very fragile, so you can't crush it this way. You really have to work it from the top of the nib, because if you attempt to push down on this, it's just going to smush it and it's going to look aesthetically awful. It'll work, but it just won't look good. And when you push the nib back in, you got to kind of really grip it from this slopey part here to get it in. The newer feeds may be a little stronger, but a lot of the older ones definitely have this. They changed the design slightly, but I would still be careful based on just what could happen. Anyway, JOWO nibs fit into the housing. Sorry, that's a little out of focus. No, JOWO nibs fit into the housing. I'm gonna assume, although who knows, that we could probably get a Jinhao nib in there if for some reason you wanted that. Although Penbbs nibs come in medium, fine, and extra fine, and they even come with this like kind of architect-y fude, half fude nib. Well, that seems to fit. Maybe not as tight as the JOWO does, but this also maybe a little loose in there. That feels pretty good. So that is just a quick note about Penbbs, also very interchangeable. So as you see, what I'm trying to do here is I'm going to have to line it up because that is also keyed inside. But as you can see, I'm not actually holding the most of the feed. I'm putting my nail right there, and an argument for why it's good to have nails when you're doing nib work. And I pushed it in like that, and it's seated properly, and I can tell you it'll write terrifically from here on out. I have every confidence in it. Okay, moving right along. So that is the number 6 nib from Jinhao. You can buy other nibs that fit. I know this, I can tell you these fit Penbbs. They might fit Jinhao as well. They come from Fuliwen, and the benefit of those are you can get some of these nibs with big balls of tipping. Now, they're not finished in a way that you could actually write with them, but they can be kind of fun. So as you see, this is the Fuliwen with, I think this is the 1.1 ball of tipping, and you see it goes right into the Jinhao. So what we're seeing is obviously a couple of different things. One is that although some of the Chinese nibs, the units themselves are proprietary, it's actually not hard to swap these things between them. So you see like this went on there just fine. This doesn't really fit well. So I would not recommend that one. But they have some versatility amongst makers that you might not see amongst the Western makers. That is Schmidt, Bock, and JOWO. We're going to move on to a different category. So what do I have here? I have here a Narwhal or Nahvalur nib unit. And I've referenced this on the channel before, that I use them in other pens, right? So let's look at 3 different pens, or we're actually going to look at 3 different nib units. 2 are coming from another pen, and then we have the Nahvalur there. All right. Forgive me, I'm just opening the box on this Asvine. So, got this Asvine, got it on Prime Day, which is one of the reasons Asvine's kind of great, Asvine. It's the what is this? The P50. And I really like the shape of it. This is actually not my first one, but I decided to pull the trigger on this because they were on sale. So we have the P50, and then we have a Majohn here. And this is, I forget the model number, but it's all metal, it's not plastic, and it is also a piston filler. So I'm going to actually just really quick unscrew this and show you how, how alike these nib units are. Oh, interesting. So this one is actually, well, I didn't realize it, but this is actually the same as a Bock nib unit. So you can actually put a Bock unit in there instead. But I wonder if the narwhal will fit in there. And it's not really, yeah. All right, so that works in there. Interesting. So I like, because narwhal makes different nib sizes. The Asvine nib units tend to only be available in extra fine, fine, and medium. And I like that narwhal goes all the way up to double broad. So that's a double broad. Okay. Let's see if this will, well, we know that fits in there. Let's see if this will fit in there. Well, we have a discovery here, which is that the Bock nib housing actually works in these pens. So if you wanted to swap out, now Bock obviously sells different nibs. You may have Bock nibs lying around in greater sizes than either Majohn / Moonman or Asvine make, gives you actually another option that I didn't even realize. So the Moonman nib unit screws into the P50, and I expect the narwhal nib unit will screw into this Majohn. There we go. So what we learned today, and I didn't know until I actually got this open, and let's just get this O-ring keeps sliding off. There we go. Is that Bock nibs appear to be interchangeable. And just to confirm that that's the case, let's try putting this Levenger Bock nib. Oop, that did not want to go. So that's interesting. So that will fit, and I wonder if it's slight differences. Put this one in. No problem. Interesting. So does that mean that the Bock will go in here? Yeah. Fascinating. Okay. So some of these pens will take the Bock. The Asvine will take Bock nibs, but the Majohn won't take Bock nibs. However, we'll take the Asvine Bock housing as well as the Nahvalur and obviously Majohn, and therefore the other Asvine number 6 housing. So I wanted to point this all out in one discrete category because I know that these nibs are interchangeable, and it just, it's easy to acquire a lot of these Majohn pens or Asvine pens, and the nibs seem to sort of only be available in like 3 sizes. So it is just kind of nice to be able to say, okay, well, you know what? Today I want to have a double broad P50 and just be able to go and put that together. And in fact, that's what I'm going to do. So there's the P50. The last thing I want to cover is the Chinese number 8 nibs. So I have the 3 biggest examples of companies that are consistently making them. I know there's the Hongdian N11, I think it is, or the N9 came out. That doesn't seem to be something that's continually made, so I figured we'd leave that to the side for now. But what I have here is a Jinhao number 8 nib unit. I have the Asvine C2000. I have the Majohn P140 and the P139. The P140 is obviously filled, but it's a demonstrator, so will help us talk a little bit about it. So the first question is, are any of these interchangeable? So let's just take them apart in a way that we can work with. So I think it's true of all of these, but basically when you unscrew everybody from their housing, they're all different. This, by the way, has a double O-ring system, but the O-ring is inside to help seal the bottom of this nib unit. This basically is a converter pen, right? So they don't have it sealing in the same way. I believe that this nib unit and that one are identical, because if you look in, they basically look the same through the plastic. So that is the first thing to notice. Now, I don't think you can screw any of these things into each other because they just won't. Well, this one actually, it stops, and that's because of that giant O-ring there. So that is the interchangeability of the whole nib units themselves. The bigger question is whether you are going to see the ability to swap them amongst each other once they're out of their housing. So you can see these slide out pretty easily. So let's see, this one doesn't fit at all, which means that likely this will be too small to fit in there. So that's not interchangeable. And then the question is whether this will go in there. So let's see if we can inch this out a little bit. Okay. Could work. Let's see. That's stuck in there. Let's see. Well, this will go on here. It looks like it stops, so that's not going to work. And I think the feed is much longer from the Asvine. Not about much longer, but it is longer. So this may actually work in the Asvine, but not the other way around. Yep. So to the extent you want it, not great, but serviceable. So to the extent you wanted a Jinhao nib in your Asvine, I'll probably never get that right. You could have that to your heart's desire. So that's that one. That's this one. And again, these sections these housings are keyed to accept the nib in a certain place. So once you do that, they come back together really easily. So that is the number 8 nibs. Now, one last thing I'm going to say, and this is just something to look out for. So these nibs that are in the Majohn, I love them, don't get me wrong. And I think that they are supposed to mimic the Bock number 8s. Sorry, you can see they're almost identical. Now, I've seen other makers using feeds that look like this. I'm not going to say names. I'm not going to say where it is. But I'd be curious for anyone that has a pen that has this pen or another one of the Majohn number 8 nibs and has a feed that looks like this, that's not a Bock nib, that's someone else's nib unit. I'd be curious to hear if these fit or if they unscrewed them and they're identical. Because I feel like these tend to be on, we'll say, less conventional filling systems than cartridges and converters. And this whole thing with the giant O-ring in there makes me wonder even more if that's what is in part playing out. In any event, so those are the common number 8 nib units you see from the Chinese nib makers, and very little interchangeability amongst them. That is the second part of my intro, my explanation of standardized nib units. Obviously, I put in some other stuff, but I think in the end, I got out a lot, and I hope it was helpful for people. I've now been doing this for 2 months, and it's been a great experience. Slowly, people are coming into the fold. Sometimes I'm surprised by some of the things people really latch on to, but I'm glad to be making content that people are happy with and they're learning from. That's why I'm doing it. And so I hope you continue to stay with me through more videos. Let me know in the comment section things you want to hear about. I am open to obviously explaining things at any amount of length, sometimes ad nauseum. I'll deal with that at some point. But in any event, thank you again so much, and I look forward to seeing you on another episode of Uncapped real soon. Bye.